Well, we've been going through Proverbs and learning from the wisdom of Solomon. How many of you can tell me who the richest man alive is right now? Of course, the answer is Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. Jeff Bezos' net worth is currently just under $117 billion. I decided to look that up and see how that compares with other people who have lived in the past, because that's a lot of money. Most of the sources I looked at list John D. Rockefeller as the richest man in history. If you adjust his net worth for inflation, it's estimated that John D. Rockefeller would have been worth approximately $367 billion by today's standards. That's almost 2.5 times Jeff Bezos' net worth. However, even that pales in comparison with the wealth of Solomon. I did a Google search to see how rich Solomon was, and the general consensus is that, again, adjusted for inflation, by today's standards, Solomon's net worth would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 trillion. Now, I just want to read you 2 Chronicles chapter 9, which kind of tells us about the wealth that Solomon accumulated. I will be reading this out of the NLT because it uses words like tons instead of talents, which is easier for us to understand. But this is what it says in 2 Chronicles chapter 9, starting with verse 13. Each year, Solomon received about 25 tons of gold. This did not include the additional revenue he received from merchants and traders. All the kings of Arabia and the governors of the provinces also brought gold and silver to Solomon. King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold, each weighing more than 15 pounds. He also made 300 smaller shields of hammered gold, each weighing more than 7.5 pounds. The king placed these shields in the palace of the forest of Lebanon. I'm not sure they were actually there for defense. I think they were there more for decoration, hanging on the walls. Then the king made a huge throne, decorated with ivory and overlaid with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps with a footstool of gold. There were armrests on both sides of the seat, and a figure of a lion stood at each side of the throne. There were also 12 other lions, one standing on each end of the 6 steps. No other throne in all the world could be compared with it. All of King Solomon's drinking cups were solid gold, as were all the utensils in the palace of the forest of Lebanon. They were not made of silver, for silver was considered worthless in Solomon's day. The king had a fleet of trading ships of Tarshish, manned by the sailors sent by Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships returned, loaded with gold, silvery, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So King Solomon became richer and wiser than any king on earth. Kings from every nation came to consult him and to hear the wisdom God had given him. Year after year, everyone who visited brought him gifts of silver and gold, clothing, weapons, spices, horses, and mules. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for his horses and chariots, and he had 12,000 horses. He stationed some of them in the chariot cities and some near him in Jerusalem. He ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates River in the north to the land of the Philistines and the border of Egypt in the south. The king made silver as plentiful in Jerusalem as stone, and that's why we read earlier, silver was not considered a value. It wasn't that it wasn't valuable, it's just that there was so much of it that it was very, very common. That just describes how rich he actually was. And valuable cedar timber was as common as the sycamore fig trees that grow in the foothills of Judea. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and many other countries. Now, let me break this down for you just a little bit. It says Solomon received 25 tons of gold each year. That's not counting the other stuff. Just gold, 25 tons. The current price of gold is $1,889 per ounce. So that would be equal to $60,448 per ton. He received 25 tons of gold per year, which means he was getting approximately $1.5 billion each year in just gold. That's per year. Each year, he got more in just gold than Jeff Bezos' total net worth. Many people seek financial advice from people like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Donald Trump, or other successful businessmen. Some of them have written letters, or they do periodical articles explaining. I mean, people follow Warren Buffett to see what he's investing in because they want to invest in the same things he's investing in because they think if they can do what he does, they're going to be like him. People seek these men for advice on their finances. Today, we're going to get financial advice from someone who had more wealth than all of those men combined. We've already learned that Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. We're learning today he was also the richest man that ever lived. One of the themes that appears several times in the book of Proverbs deals with money and what our attitude should be towards it. The first principle I want us to learn today is start with God. We actually don't find this principle directly in Proverbs, although Solomon does address it in a roundabout way, which we're going to look at in a minute. But if we look at the whole story of Solomon, we discover where Solomon's wealth actually came from. We talked a little bit about that the first week of our series. In 2 Chronicles chapter 1, we read about the beginning of Solomon's reign. The first thing that Solomon did after he became king was to worship God. If we look at the story, we see that not only did Solomon worship God, he also asked for all of Israel. In fact, he decreed, he said, we all need to come together to worship God. Solomon himself offered 1,000 sacrifices. Then in verse 7, we read that God was so pleased with Solomon that he told Solomon to ask for anything, and it would be given to him. Solomon asked for wisdom. But not just for wisdom's sake. No, he asked for wisdom to do the right thing as king. He wanted to make sure that every decision he made was a God decision. He wanted to be righteous in all of his dealings and govern as God himself would govern. So since Solomon put God first, God gave him not only the wisdom he asked for, but everything else as well. And we read that in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 11 to 12. God said to Solomon, since this is your heart's desire, and you have not asked for wealth, possessions, or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you have not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people, over whom I have made you as king, therefore, wisdom and knowledge will be given to you, and I will also give you wealth, possessions, and honor, such as no king who was ever before you had, and none after you will have. What was it that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 about seeking God first? Seek first the kingdom of God, and his righteousness, and everything else will be given to you as well. That's the first principle. Seek God first. Make him your number one priority. A lot of people are trying to be successful or make it big in their own strength. Some do succeed, at least for a while. But many, although they enjoyed earthly success for a while, die. Not only penniless, but actually millions or billions of dollars in debt. I did a lot of research this week as I was preparing this message into wealth, where it comes from, who had it, where it went, etc. Now, I don't have time to pass on everything I found, but there was one interesting insight that kept jumping out at me. By and large, most of the successful businessmen from years past who put God first in everything died with their corporations and fortunes still intact, while a majority of those who built their empires without God left nothing but debt to their families. In fact, the righteous, the godly businessmen from years ago, some of them who lived generations ago, their corporations are still intact, and their families, their children, their grandchildren are still running those companies successfully where other people, the businesses, no longer even exist, a lot of them. Don't just take my word for it. Do your own research. I'm not saying that they don't exist, but I didn't find anyone that put God first for their entirety of their lives that lost everything they had. Some of them, their corporations at their death, weren't worth what they were at the peak, but they still had their corporations. They still had money. They always had enough, and they died content. Where other people, many of them lost everything, died actually with billions of dollars in debt that their families had to try to pay off, or a few of them died actually still having money, but they died miserable and alone. They weren't happy even though they had all the riches in the world. All you need to do is Google famous people who died broke or millionaires who died broke to read about what happens to those who didn't follow God's principle of putting God first. You can also do other searches to find those who did it God's way and were successful. I'm going to help you out with that one, though. I want to give you just a few names that you might want to look up. People like J.C. Penney, the founder of the J.C. Penney stores, or Sam Walton, founder of Walmart. And actually, this is kind of cool. Sam Walton actually got his start working for J.C. Penney and learned some of the godly principles from J.C. Penney, so he incorporated those into his own corporation. Henry Heinz, the founder of Heinz Corporation, ketchup. Mary Kay Ash, the founder of Mary Kay Cosmetics. John D. Rockefeller, which we talked about a little bit ago, the founder of Standard Fuel Company. And my favorite, R.G. Letourneau, the inventor of earth-moving equipment, which now we know as Caterpillar, but actually all of the big earth-moving equipment and all of the big military trucks and things they use in the military. He is the one that came up with the technology and patented and designed those things. All of these people became successful the same way that Solomon did, by putting God first. They also practiced all the other principles that we're going to be looking at today from the book of Proverbs. And one of the things you will notice about all these people that I just mentioned is none of them set a goal to be rich. They were simply trying to provide for their families and wanted to honor God as they did it. They simply made a contract with God to honor Him with everything and to run their companies ethically and honestly and treat their employees and customers the way that God Himself would treat them. That's why Solomon asked for the wisdom. I want to rule as you would rule. And that brings us to the second principle for today. This principle is found in Proverbs, but it actually doesn't come from Solomon. This is found in chapter 30, which we're told was written by Agur. Agur was another wise man that is believed to have lived around the same time as Solomon, which kind of explains why it was included with Solomon's wise words. We're actually not sure if Solomon actually wrote Proverbs as a book or if these were just a compilation of sayings that he made throughout his lifetime that somebody put down after his death. But Agur's saying is put there in chapter 30. And the second principle is be content. We read this in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 7 to 9. 2 things I ask of you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God. Part of the Lord's Prayer says, give us this day our daily bread. Very few people can actually be trusted with wealth. Most people always want more, regardless of what they already have. But they want it for the wrong reasons, and they spend it selfishly and unwisely. Could it be that God doesn't bless some of us because He knows us too well and He wants to protect us? He knows that wealth will corrupt us. It will spoil us. It will give us a hunger for simply more wealth instead of more for Him. One of the Beatitudes says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Goes back to the first principle. When we seek God first, when we're content with what we have and simply seek God for our daily needs, when God sees that we can honor Him and put Him first, He begins to give us additional. Money or wealth in themselves aren't wrong, but they do have a tendency to corrupt. It's kind of like what we learned last week about anger. Anger isn't sin, but anger puts us at the doorway to sin. Money isn't evil, but too much or too little can lead to corruption. The question we need to ask is, who decides what is too much or too little? Is it by judging what we have compared to somebody else? Is it by saying, I want that and I don't have it, so I don't have enough? Essentially, if we have enough to provide our daily needs, we have enough. Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 to 12, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. We need to be content, whatever our circumstances. Principle number 3, work hard. Principle 1 taught us it all starts with God. But God also wants us to do our part. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 9 to 11. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. Proverbs 10:4. Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. Proverbs 12:11. Those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies have no sense. Proverbs 14:23. All hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. God created us to work. It's built into our DNA. When God created Adam and Eve, He gave them a job to do. He didn't just put us in this beautiful garden and say, okay, just enjoy the garden. Yeah, they were to enjoy the garden, but He knew that just simply enjoying what He gave them with nothing to do would corrupt them. So He put them in there to work. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, it says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. God designed us to work and to work hard. Now, work became more difficult after Adam and Eve sinned and were booted out of the garden, but it was still required of them. Let me say, though, work will always be work, but it's easier when we put God first and honor Him, because God does most of the heavy lifting for us if we're trusting Him. Statistics say that right now the suicide rate is higher than it's ever been. I think a big part of that is because fewer people are working. Right now they've closed everything down, and when people aren't working, they feel like they don't have a value. What am I here for? They get discouraged. They get frustrated. We were designed to work. And if we're not able to go to our jobs, we should still find things to do. We can plant a garden. We can go help our neighbor with a task that they need done. We need to work. Work gives us purpose. Christians in particular should be hard workers because we are witnesses to those around us and because we're working for the Lord. Colossians 3:23-24 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. When we're lazy or idle, we weaken our witness for God because people lose their respect for us. The Apostle Paul addressed this problem in the Thessalonian church. The Thessalonians were quitting their jobs and trying to justify it spiritually. They said there was no point in working because Jesus was going to be coming back soon, and then all their work would be in vain. Why work hard to do all these things and then just have somebody else enjoy it? We're just going to wait and let Jesus take us out of this world. There were several problems with that way of thinking. One was that since they had no income or crops of their own, they were sponging off everyone else who lived around them. They still needed to eat, so they expected other people to take care of them. It actually made Christianity look bad because Christians were perceived as freeloaders. So Paul addressed this problem, and he said in 1 Thessalonians 4:11, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business. Now, I don't think he's necessarily talking about minding your business. He's talking about take care of your own business, do your own work. And you should work with your hands just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Apparently, the message wasn't clear enough the first time, because Paul addressed it again in his second letter to the church. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 to 12, he says, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we command you, brothers and sisters, to keep away from every believer who is idle and disruptive and does not live according to the teaching that you receive from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anybody's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so that we would not be a burden to you. We did this not because we don't have the right to such help, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you to imitate. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. Now, he didn't say the one who is unable. There are some people who cannot work, but those who can should. He goes on. We hear that some of you are idle and disruptive. They are not busy. They are busy bodies. That's what happens when people aren't doing what they were supposed to do. They become busy bodies instead of actually being busy, instead of being workers. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the food they eat. Stop expecting everybody else to take care of you. Go out and earn your own food or grow your own food. Find a way to take care of yourself, if at all possible. As Christians, people are watching us at work. What do they see? Does your work ethic as an employer or as an employee bring respect and honor to God? Or does it cause people to want nothing to do with God? If we want God to bless us, we must honor Him. And part of honoring Him means to work hard and work with integrity. There's another reason, though, that we work besides just providing for ourselves. The Bible teaches us that we should also work so that we can help others that are in need. Let me give you a couple of scriptures first from the New Testament, and then we'll look at what Proverbs says about the same topic. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28 says, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with their own hands. Why? That they may have something to share with those in need. And I wonder if maybe he wasn't just talking about actual people who were actually stealing, actually thieves, but maybe he's talking about some of these people like those that were in the Thessalonian church who were in a way stealing because they were expecting everybody else to take care of them when they could take care of themselves. He says, don't just provide your own needs, but work so that you can have enough to share with others who are in need. And 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 25 says, no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. All of chapter 8 in 2 Corinthians addresses an offering that Paul was collecting to help the believers in Macedonia who were going through a really tough time financially. The Corinthian believers had excess, and he encouraged them to give generously to help the Macedonians who had nothing. This is what he says, 2 Corinthians 8:14. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need. Paul said the time is coming where you may need the help. Right now, you can be a helper. Down the road, you may need help. So you help now so that you can get help when you need it in return. Then he says the goal is equality, as it is written. The one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Paul wasn't promoting communism. Giving in the Bible context is never forced. It's never the government's going to tell you how much to give so they can take care of somebody else. However, the Bible says if we truly love God, we will love others. And we will want to help them when we have the ability to help them. It's not just about this is what I have, so what can I do for myself? This is what I have, so how can I use what I've been given by God to be a blessing to other people? We see that principle played over and over in the book of Acts. Those who had shared with those who were in need. All of the people that I told you about earlier that built their companies on godly principles understood this principle. All of them were generous givers. They didn't just give 10% out of religious obligation or look good for the press. They gave away millions of dollars because they loved God and they loved people and they saw somebody in need and they said, I'm going to give to that need. I have it. They can use it. God has blessed me, but it's His money, so I'm going to give it away. My favorite out of that list of people I gave you, as I already said, is R.G. Letourneau. R.G. Letourneau, by the end of his life, was giving 90% of his income away. He was giving 90% back to God. It wasn't like, well, I'm going to give God my 10%. He was giving 90% away and living off of 10% himself. And you look at all the others, they were all giving way more than 10%. Why? Because they could. Some of you are saying, yeah, but it would be easy to give if I had more to give. Those people had so much, they could give away a lot and still have plenty. I don't have that much. Listen to what John D. Rockefeller said when somebody asked him about tithing. He was being interviewed for a magazine, and they said, do you tithe? He said, yes, I tithe. And I would like to tell you how it all came about. I had begun to work as a small boy to help support my mother. My first wages amounted to $1.50 per week. The first week after I went to work, I took the $1.50 home to my mother, and she held the money in her lap and explained to me that she would be happy if I would give 1/10 to the Lord. I did. And from that week until this day, I have tithed every dollar that God has entrusted to me. And I want to say, if I had not tithed the first dollar I made, I would not have tithed the first $1 million I made. He goes on to say, train the children to tithe, and they will grow up to be faithful stewards of the Lord. When we learn to give out of our little that we have, God multiplies that little until pretty soon we can give a lot. But we start where we're at, not where we'd like to be sometime in the future. That's principle number 4. Give generously. Let me give you some scriptures in Proverbs that talk about that. Proverbs 11, 24 to 25. One man gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Proverbs 19, 17. He who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Proverbs 22:9 says, a generous man will himself be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 through 10. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. We don't give because of obligation to give or as an investment, because a lot of people say, well, I'm going to give because I want God to give me back. That's not why we give. We don't give because we want to get. There is a principle in the Bible that says if we give, God is going to give us back. Give and you shall receive. That is a principle there, but that's not why we give. The reason we give is because we're acknowledging, goes back to the beginning, put God first. When we give, we're acknowledging that everything we have came from God. We wouldn't have any of it if it wasn't for Him. And because we know that He will continue to provide for our needs in the future. When we give, it's a sign that our trust is in God, not in our abilities or keeping our job or whatever the economy will do. Our trust is in God. God gave me this, and I know that if I need more, He's going to give me more. So I'm going to give a little bit back as a sign and as a thank you that I trust God and I know that it's all His. Many people claim to trust God, but they always take what they need for themselves first before they give God. They say, well, I got to do this. I want to do this. I need that. I'm going to do all. If there's anything left, then I'll be happy to bless somebody else, but I'm going to take care of me first. Of course, there's quite a few stories in the Bible that talk about that. The widow and her oil who said, hey, I will give to the prophet of God first. Look what God did for her. There's lots of stories that illustrate that principle. If you give God the leftovers, there's seldom going to be anything left over, because our appetite for more is always greater than what we can provide on our own. But when we honor God and give to Him first, He has the amazing ability not only to change our desires and help us become content with what we already have, because if we get right down to it, all of us are incredibly blessed just with what we have now. But He also, when we begin to give first, He begins to provide exceedingly more than we could ever imagine. If we were to sit down with Solomon and ask him, the wealthiest man that ever lived, say, what is the secret to your success? How can I be blessed financially? He would tell us, start with God. Make God your number one priority. Put God first in everything. Second, be content with what you already have. You already have enough. Just be content with that until God decides to bless you with more. Third thing he'd say is don't just sit back waiting for it to come. Work hard. And then he would say, give generously. When we give, God says, hey, I can trust them with more. They're not hoarding this for themselves. They are honoring me. They are looking out for other people. I am going to give them more so that they have more to give.